Texas, 1944. Dawn broke cold over Camp Hearn, painting the horizon in shades of copper and ash. A dozen German women stood in a dusty corral, breath visible in the morning air, hands trembling not from cold but from something deeper. They had been told Americans were brutal. They had expected chains and cruelty. Instead, a weathered cowboy named Jim Caldwell handed them leather gloves and nodded toward the cattle. The war had taught them to fear this moment. What happened next would teach them something else entirely. The cattle cars rumbled through West Texas on a July afternoon in 1944, carrying human cargo that defied every expectation. Inside, 43 German women sat in silence, their faces pressed against wooden slats, watching America pass in fragments. Endless sky, telephone poles marching toward infinity. Towns with names they couldn't pronounce. They were prisoners of war. But not the prisoners America expected. Most were nurses, captured in North Africa when Rommel's medical units collapsed in the Tunisian dust. A few were civilian administrators, swept up when the Africa Corps surrendered in May 1943. Their ages ranged from 19 to 47. They had treated German soldiers under artillery fire. They had seen men die calling for mothers who would never know their graves. Now they were thousands of miles from home, riding through a landscape so vast it seemed to swallow fear itself. The train slowed near Hearn, Texas, population 9,000, where cotton fields stretched to the horizon, and the war felt like something happening on another planet. Guards, American soldiers barely older than the prisoners, opened the doors. Sunlight flooded in, blinding after hours of dimness. The heat hit like a physical force. "Out," one guard said, not unkindly. "Watch your step." They climbed down onto red dirt that stained their worn shoes. The sky overhead was enormous, unmarked by buildings or mountains, just blue stretching forever. Several women looked up and felt vertigo, as if they might fall into all that emptiness. Camp Hearn sprawled across 700 acres of former farmland. Barbed wire fenced the perimeter. Guard towers stood at intervals, but compared to the camps they'd imagined, brick walls, iron bars, concrete cells, this looked temporary, almost casual. Wooden barracks painted white, a recreation area with benches, laundry lines strung between buildings. In the distance, cattle grazed in fields that might have been anywhere in rural Germany, except for the quality of light, that particular Texas brightness that turned everything sharp-edged and clear. Lieutenant Patricia Morrison, head of the Women's Army Corps detachment assigned to the camp, waited with a clipboard and an expression that gave nothing away. She was 32 from Oklahoma, a former teacher who'd enlisted after Pearl Harbor. She'd been briefed on the prisoners, enemy combatants potentially dangerous, indoctrinated with Nazi ideology. She'd been told to watch for escape attempts, for resistance, for the 1,000 ways trained soldiers might subvert authority. What she saw were exhausted women in threadbare uniforms squinting against the sun, trying to maintain dignity in a moment designed to strip it away. "I'm Lieutenant Morrison," she said in clear, measured English. "You'll be processed, assigned quarters, and given camp regulations. Follow orders and you'll be treated according to the Geneva Convention. Cause trouble and privileges will be revoked. Understood?" A few nodded. Most just stared, understanding perhaps half the words, but catching the tone. Firm, professional, neither cruel nor kind. They were marched to a processing building where they surrendered personal items, letters from home, photographs, a few had rosaries or religious medals. Everything was cataloged and stored. They were photographed, fingerprinted, given medical examinations by an army doctor who worked in silence, checking for disease, for malnutrition, for the physical toll of 2 years in transit camps across North Africa, then Sicily, then a ship to Norfolk, Virginia before the final train west. Greta Hoffman, 23, a nurse from Munich, stood for her photograph and tried to remember the last time she'd looked in a mirror. Her reflection in the photographer's flash was a stranger. Hollow cheeks, eyes too large, hair that had once been carefully curled now hanging limp and dull. She thought of her mother, wondered if letters could reach Germany, if anyone at home even knew she was alive. By evening, they were assigned to Barracks D, the women's section, separated from the male POW compound by a fence and 100 yards of open ground. Inside, they found army cots with thin mattresses, footlockers, 2 communal bathrooms. It was sparse, utilitarian, but clean. Windows had screens instead of bars. Doors had locks on the inside. That night, lying on her cot while the Texas heat pressed down through the roof, Greta listened to women crying quietly in the darkness. Some prayed in whispered German. Others just breathed, shallow and quick, trying to orient themselves in this new geometry of captivity. She thought of what she'd been told during training in Germany, that Americans were soft, decadent, incapable of real discipline. That capture meant torture, starvation, humiliation. Yet today they'd been given clean clothes, hot food, beds with sheets. The guard at dinner had said "ma'am" when passing bread. Nothing made sense. The ranchers came on a Tuesday morning in early August, driving pickup trucks that kicked up dust plumes visible a mile away. They parked outside the camp administration building, killed the engines, and sat for a moment, adjusting their hats, trying to figure out exactly what they'd volunteered for. Camp Hearn needed labor. The war had drained every able-bodied man from Robertson County, leaving farms understaffed, cattle untended, crops rotting in fields. The Army, pragmatic and desperate, had started a work program using POW labor. Male prisoners already worked in cotton fields, road crews, lumber camps. But the women were a different problem. Geneva Convention restrictions were stricter, supervision requirements more complex. Then Major Harrison, camp commander, had an idea. The surrounding ranches needed help with dairy operations, chicken coops, vegetable gardens, work that fell under acceptable POW labor classifications. And there were ranchers, older men exempt from service who could provide supervision while teaching practical skills. Jim Caldwell was 56 with hands like leather and eyes permanently squinted from decades of Texas sun. He ran a cattle operation 20 miles west of Hearn, 800 acres that his father had homesteaded in 1889. His 2 sons were overseas, one in the Pacific, one with Patton in France. He'd come to the camp because Harrison had asked, and because sitting idle while the country fought felt like dying slowly. "You'll be working with the women prisoners," Harrison explained in his office, a fan turning overhead, moving hot air in circles, teaching them ranch work, milking mostly, some garden maintenance, maybe chicken handling. "They dangerous?" Caldwell asked. "They're nurses, clerks, not exactly SS officers." "They speak English?" "Some, enough." Harrison leaned back, the chair creaking. "Look, Jim, I know this is unusual, but they need productive work, we need labor, and I need supervisors I can trust not to make this political." Caldwell nodded slowly. Politics didn't interest him. Cattle did. Work did. The notion that doing a job well mattered regardless of who was doing it. That interested him. "When do I start?" "Tomorrow, 5 a.m. Bring whoever else you can round up." The women were assembled in the mess hall at dawn, standing in uneven rows, still adjusting to the wake-up call that came when darkness still held the camp. Lieutenant Morrison stood at the front with Caldwell and 2 other ranchers, Tom Webb, 61, who ran a dairy operation, and Frank Ochoa, 45, Mexican-American, whose family had raised cattle in Texas since before it was Texas. "You're being assigned to agricultural work details," Morrison announced, her voice carrying in the morning stillness. "These men will supervise and instruct. You'll work 4 hours each morning, 6 days a week. Pay is 80 cents per day credited to your camp accounts. This is voluntary." "Voluntary," Greta whispered to the woman beside her, Anna, a clerk from Hamburg. "If you refuse, you remain in the compound during work hours. No pay, no privileges." It wasn't really a choice. Caldwell stepped forward, hat in hand, scanning the faces before him. He saw exhaustion, wariness, fear poorly hidden. He thought of his own daughters, grown now, one a teacher in Austin, the other married to a mechanic in San Antonio. These women could be their ages, could be their friends in another universe where nationality didn't determine enmity. "Morning," he said, his voice rough but not unkind. "My name's Jim Caldwell. I run cattle west of here. We're going to teach you ranch work. Milking cows, tending chickens, garden maintenance. It's honest labor. You work hard, we'll treat you fair. That's the deal." Someone translated into German, whispers passing down the rows. "Any of you worked with animals before?" A few hands rose tentatively. "Good, then you'll help teach the others." He gestured toward the door. "Truck's outside. Let's go see what you're made of." The dairy barn sat a quarter-mile from the main compound, a long wooden structure with a corrugated metal roof that ticked and creaked as the morning warmed. Inside, 23 Holstein cows waited in stanchions, their breath visible in the cool air, tails swishing at flies, eyes large and indifferent. Greta stepped through the doorway and stopped. The smell hit first: hay, manure, milk, sweat. A concentrated essence of animal life that was somehow both pleasant and overwhelming. The cows were massive, much larger than she'd expected, their black and white hides gleaming in the light from high windows. She had never touched a cow in her life. In Munich, milk came in bottles from a truck. Meat came from a butcher. The countryside was somewhere people vacationed, not somewhere you worked. Her entire understanding of food production was abstract, theoretical, disconnected from the actual labor of feeding a nation. "All right," Caldwell said, moving down the line of stanchions, running his hand along the cow's flanks with the ease of long familiarity. "Milking's not complicated, but it takes practice. You'll start by watching, then we'll walk you through it." He pulled a three-legged stool beside a cow named Bessie. He introduced her like a person, and settled onto it with a grunt. The bucket clinked as he positioned it. His hands, enormous and weathered, moved to the udder with surprising gentleness. "You grip here," he demonstrated, fingers encircling the teat, "and you squeeze top down like this. Not yanking, not twisting. Steady pressure, rhythm, let the milk come natural." White streams hit the bucket with a metallic ring, then a deeper sound as liquid accumulated. The cow shifted her weight but didn't pull away. Caldwell kept talking, his voice low and even, explaining pressure points, warning signs of distress, the importance of keeping everything clean. "Who wants to try first?" Silence. The women looked at each other, at the massive animals, at their own soft hands that had held surgical instruments and typewriters, but never anything that required this kind of physical strength. Finally, Greta stepped forward. Someone had to. Caldwell stood, gesturing to the stool. She sat, the wood hard beneath her, and stared at the cow's udder. It seemed enormous up close, warm to the touch when she finally worked up courage to make contact. The teat felt foreign in her hand, alive, responsive, not at all like the sterile environment of a hospital ward. "Go on," Caldwell encouraged. "She won't bite." Greta squeezed. Nothing happened. She tried again, gripping harder, pulling down. The cow shifted, making a low sound. "Easier," Caldwell said, moving beside her, his hand covering hers, showing the motion. "Let the milk do the work. You're guiding it, not forcing it." His hand was calloused, rough as tree bark, but his touch was patient. He smelled of coffee and tobacco and leather. She tried again, following the rhythm he'd shown, and suddenly milk squirted into the bucket, a thin stream that made her gasp in surprise. "There you go," he said, stepping back. "Keep that motion, find your rhythm." She milked, awkwardly at first, then with growing confidence. Her forearms began to ache. Her back complained from the unfamiliar posture. But the milk kept coming, filling the bucket with a sound that was somehow satisfying, proof of labor translating into something tangible. By the time she finished, her hands were trembling. Caldwell inspected her work, nodded approval, and moved to the next woman. One by one they tried. Some took to it naturally. Others struggled, frustrated by their own incompetence, by how difficult something so simple could be. Anna squeezed too hard and got kicked. Not seriously, just a warning nudge that sent her sprawling backward into the hay. The other women gasped, but Caldwell just helped her up, checked for injuries, and pointed to a different cow. "Daisy's gentler," he said. "Try her." By 8 a.m., all 23 cows had been milked. The buckets transferred to metal cans, the barn cleaned, fresh hay distributed. The women stood in the morning light, exhausted, their uniforms stained with milk and dirt, hands aching, backs sore. Caldwell surveyed them with something that might have been approval. "You'll do," he said. "Same time tomorrow." They rode back to camp in silence, too tired for conversation, watching the sun climb higher, turning the landscape gold. Greta flexed her fingers, felt the new soreness there, and thought about how strange it was that she'd spent the morning milking cows for her captors, and felt for the first time since Tunisia, useful. They had been told that Americans were monsters. This was not metaphor or exaggeration. It was official doctrine, repeated in training, reinforced by newspapers, broadcast on radio. The Reich's propaganda machine had painted the United States as a nation of gangsters and savages, where black Americans were lynched for sport, where Native Americans lived in poverty on reservations, where capitalism created vast inequalities and desperate violence. The message was clear: capture meant death or worse. So when Greta and the others found themselves riding to the ranch each morning, eating the same food as the guards, sleeping in barracks with unlocked doors, the cognitive dissonance was profound. "They fed us steak last night," Anna whispered one evening, lying on her cot staring at the ceiling. "Steak? When was the last time we had meat in Germany?" 1942, someone answered from across the room. Maybe 41. It was true. Rationing had strangled Germany long before the bombs started falling. In Munich, Greta had survived on bread, turnips, ersatz coffee made from acorns. Meat was a memory. Sugar didn't exist. By 1944, even bread was often unavailable. Yet here, in a POW camp in rural Texas, they ate better than civilians in Berlin. "It's a trick," Ilse muttered. She was older, 47, a stern woman from Dresden who'd worked as a logistics officer. "They want us compliant, grateful. Then they'll use us for propaganda." "Or maybe," Greta said quietly, "they're just following the Geneva Convention." Ilse glared at her but didn't argue. Facts were difficult to refute. The work routine became familiar. Wake at 4:45 a.m., assembly at 5 or trucks to the ranch by 5:15. Milking until 8:20, then breakfast. The ranchers' wives brought food, massive meals of eggs, bacon, biscuits, gravy, coffee so strong it stripped paint. At first the women were hesitant, uncertain if this was some kind of test. But hunger won. They ate, and the food was real. After breakfast came other chores: mucking stalls, repairing fences, tending the vegetable garden, where tomatoes grew fat and red in the August heat, feeding chickens, collecting eggs, learning which hens were broody and which were reliable layers. Frank Ochoa taught them about horses. He was quieter than Caldwell, spoke less, but moved with an economy of motion that spoke of lifelong expertise. He'd grown up speaking Spanish and English interchangeably, navigating the complex racial dynamics of Texas, where Mexican Americans occupied a space between white and other, accepted but separate. "This is Cisco," he said, leading a chestnut mare from the stable. "She's gentle, good for beginners." Greta approached slowly. The horse was enormous, radiating warmth, smelling of hay and sweat. She reached out tentatively, touched the mare's neck. The hair was softer than she'd expected, the muscle beneath solid and alive. "You can ride her," Ochoa said, "if you want. I've never ridden. First time for everything." He showed her how to mount, how to hold the reins, how to use her legs to communicate. The saddle was Western style, nothing like the English saddles she'd seen in photographs. Sitting astride the horse, feeling its power between her legs, the ground suddenly distant, Greta felt a rush of fear and exhilaration. "Just walk her around the corral," Ochoa instructed. "Let her do the work." The horse moved, and Greta gripped the saddle horn, heart pounding. But Cisco was patient, responding to the lightest pressure, moving in a lazy circle while Ochoa watched, ready to intervene if needed. "You're a natural," he called. She wasn't. She was terrified. But something in her responded to the challenge, to the requirement of trust between rider and animal. to the way fear could transform into confidence through repetition. By the end of the week, she could trot. By the end of the month, she was helping exercise the ranch horses riding out to check fence lines, feeling the Texas wind in her face and thinking how impossible it would have been to explain this to her younger self. The Red Cross allowed prisoners to send letters, censored but regular. Once a month, a packet of mail went out from Camp Hearn, carried across the Atlantic by ship, delivered through neutral Switzerland to Germany, where distribution was haphazard and delivery uncertain. Greta wrote to her mother in Munich, sitting at a table in the mess hall, struggling with what to say. How do you explain that captivity is nothing like you feared? That the enemy feeds you better than your own government did? That you're learning to milk cows and ride horses instead of rotting in a cell? Dearest Mama, I am safe and well treated. The camp is clean, the food adequate, the work agricultural. I am learning skills I never thought I would need. The guards are professional, the civilians we work with are kind, though I struggle with the language. I think of you constantly. I hope Munich is safe, that Father's lungs are better, that you have enough to eat. Please write if you can. I am permitted to receive mail, though it takes months. I miss home, but I am surviving. Your daughter, Greta. What she didn't write, that she'd stopped believing the things she'd been taught. That sitting beside Tom Webb during breakfast, listening to him talk about his grandchildren in Houston, she couldn't reconcile his kindness with the propaganda image of American barbarism. That Caldwell had given her leather gloves when hers wore through, expecting nothing in return. That the camp chaplain, Father McCarthy, held services in German on Sundays, translating prayers for women whose faith had been tested by years of war and loss. Anna wrote more honestly. We were lied to about everything. Ilsa refused to write at all. It happened on a September morning, the air just beginning to hint at autumn, though Texas heat still dominated. They were working in the vegetable garden, harvesting tomatoes, when a young guard, Private Jensen, barely 20, walked past with a newspaper under his arm. The headline was visible even from a distance. Allies liberate Paris. Greta straightened, dirt under her fingernails, sweat running down her spine. Paris. She'd been there once, before the war, on holiday with university friends. They'd climbed the Eiffel Tower, eaten crepes, gotten slightly drunk on wine and youth. That was 1938, when the future still seemed negotiable. Now Paris was liberated, which meant the Allies were winning, which meant Germany was losing, which meant everything she'd been told, that the war was going well, that victory was inevitable, that the fatherland would prevail, was a lie. She sat down in the dirt between tomato plants and started crying. Anna found her there, dropped to her knees beside her, wrapped her arms around her. They cried together, holding each other, mourning something they couldn't name. Not Germany's defeat exactly, but the death of certainty, the collapse of the world they'd known. Caldwell approached, moving slowly, giving them space to compose themselves. He'd fought in the First War, carried shrapnel in his left leg that ached when rain came. He knew what it looked like when the fight went out of a person. Take a break, he said quietly. Both of you. There's lemonade in the house. They walked to the ranch house, a modest structure with a wide porch where Mrs. Caldwell, Mary, 63, with silver hair, and hands permanently stained from dyeing fabric, waited with glasses of cold lemonade and something like compassion in her eyes. Sit, she commanded, not unkindly. They sat, drank, let the sugar and cold settle them. You're thinking about home, Mary said. It wasn't a question. Greta nodded. My boys are overseas, Ray's in the Pacific. Danny's somewhere in France. They don't tell us exactly where. Every morning I wake up wondering if today's the day the telegram comes. She paused, refilled their glasses. War's hard on everyone, doesn't matter which side you're on. We didn't want the war, Greta said, the English coming slowly, her accent thick. Most of us. We just lived. And suddenly there were orders and fighting, and we were part of something we didn't choose. That's how it works, Mary agreed. Men in distant cities make decisions. Rest of us live with the consequences. They sat in silence, 3 women on a porch in Texas, separated by language and nationality but united by the particular grief of waiting for wars to end. By October, the work routine had transformed from ordeal into rhythm. The women's hands developed calluses, their backs strengthened. They learned the personalities of individual cows, Bessie's stubbornness, Daisy's gentleness, Martha's tendency to kick if you weren't paying attention. They learned English through immersion, picking up ranching vocabulary, fetch, wrangle, corral, pasture, alongside everyday phrases. Caldwell was patient, repeating instructions, demonstrating rather than explaining when words failed. "You're getting good at this," he told Greta one morning, watching her milk efficiently, the bucket filling with practiced ease. "Might make a rancher out of you yet." She smiled, surprising herself. When had smiling become possible again? The answer was gradual, accumulated in small moments. Tom Webb bringing extra biscuits because he'd noticed she liked them. Frank Ochoa teaching her to braid a horse's mane, his hands guiding hers, showing the pattern. Mary Caldwell gifting her a sun hat when she noticed Greta's face burning. The chaplain finding German language books in town, building a small library for the barracks. Kindness, deployed systematically, dismantled ideology more effectively than any argument could. The male POWs, thousands of them, mostly Africa Corps veterans, worked separate shifts, different locations. They picked cotton, built roads, logged timber. Their experiences varied widely. Some camps were harsh, guards bitter about brothers killed in Europe. Others were professional, almost cordial. Camp Hearn fell somewhere in the middle. Discipline was maintained, escape attempts rare, violence minimal. The men attended classes, English language, American history, vocational training. They formed orchestras, sports teams, theater groups. They received mail, sent letters, waited for the war to end. But they didn't milk cows at dawn. They didn't ride horses with Mexican-American ranchers. They didn't sit on porches drinking lemonade with the wives of farmers whose sons were fighting in France. The women's experience was unique, shaped by labor requirements, by ranching culture, by the accident of being sent to rural Texas instead of a camp in the industrial North or urban East. "We're lucky," Anna said one evening lying on her cot, "compared to what we could have gotten." Is it luck? Greta wondered aloud. Or is it just that people are people, regardless of what we're told about enemies? No one had an answer, but the question hung in the air, reshaping how they understood everything they'd believed. November brought cooler mornings, the first hint that Texas experienced seasons, even if they were subtle. The dawn rides to the ranch required jackets now, borrowed army surplus that smelled of mothballs and old canvas. Thanksgiving arrived. The women had heard of the holiday but knew it only as an abstraction. American excess, another example of their decadence. The reality was different. The ranchers organized a dinner, pooling resources, their wives cooking for days. Turkey, mashed potatoes, green beans, cornbread, pumpkin pie. A feast that seemed impossible given wartime rationing. But rural Texas had advantages. Ranchers grew their own food, raised their own meat, maintained networks of barter and exchange that bypassed official channels. They set up tables in the ranch yard, under a sky so clear it hurt to look at. 50 people sat down together, prisoners, guards, ranchers, ranch wives, children, who stared at the German women with curiosity more than fear. Caldwell said grace, his voice rough but sincere, thanking God for the harvest, for safety, for the possibility of peace. Then everyone ate, conversation rising around the table, laughter breaking out in unexpected places. Greta sat between Mary Caldwell and Frank Ochoa's wife, Rosa, who spoke Spanish-inflected English and broken German she'd learned from her grandmother. They talked about cooking, about the difficulty of finding sugar, about the creative ways you could extend butter rations, mundane topics, the substance of normal life. "This is strange," Greta said quietly. "What is?" Rosa asked. "Eating with you, being treated like people." Rosa was quiet for a moment, then said, "You are people. War doesn't change that." After dinner, someone produced a guitar. There was singing, American folk songs the Germans didn't know, so they hummed along. Then someone sang in German, a folk song from Bavaria, and tears appeared in multiple eyes. That night back in the barracks, Greta wrote in her diary, "Today I remembered what it feels like to be human instead of a designation. Prisoner, enemy, nurse. Today I was just Greta eating turkey with strangers who treated me like a guest." December brought cold rain and news from Europe. The war was grinding toward its conclusion. Germany was retreating on all fronts. Cities were being bombed into rubble. The civilian population was starving. Letters from home became darker. Greta's mother wrote that their apartment building had been hit, that they were living in the cellar now, that father's cough had worsened, that food was almost impossible to find. The letter had taken 4 months to arrive. Anything could have happened since. The women gathered in the barracks, reading their mail, sharing news, trying to piece together what was happening in a homeland that felt increasingly abstract. Munich was being destroyed. Berlin was under constant bombardment. Hamburg was a wasteland. Dresden would burn in February, though they didn't know that yet. "My sister's dead," Ilse said flatly one evening, holding a letter from the Red Cross. "Killed in an air raid in November." No one knew what to say. The war had followed them even here, to this strange pocket of Texas where they milked cows and rode horses and almost forgot they were enemies. At the ranch, work continued. The cows still needed milking. The horses still needed exercising. The garden still required tending, even though most plants had died back for winter. Caldwell noticed the change in the women, the weight settling on them, the laughter becoming rare, the way they moved through tasks mechanically, minds elsewhere. "Heard about the bombing," he said to Greta one morning, the two of them working alone in the dairy barn. "Your home city," she nodded, not trusting herself to speak. "I'm sorry," he said simply, then added, "War's a terrible thing. No winners, really. Just survivors." She looked at him, this weathered Texas rancher who'd shown her more kindness than she'd expected from anyone, and said, "Thank you for treating us like people. What else would I treat you like? Enemies, Nazis, things that deserve punishment." He shook his head. "You're young women far from home doing work because it's available. That's all I see." It was, she realized, the most radical political statement she'd ever heard. Not because it was revolutionary, but because it was simple. A refusal to let ideology dictate humanity. April arrived with bluebonnets carpeting the fields, turning the Texas landscape into something out of a painting. The women had been at the ranch for 9 months now, long enough that the work had become second nature, the routine comforting in its predictability. Then news arrived that shook everything. Roosevelt was dead. Hitler was dead. Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. They gathered in the mess hall, listening to the announcement on the radio, trying to process what it meant. Relief, certainly. The fighting would stop. The dying would end. But also dread. What came next? What was left of Germany? What had become of their families? And underneath everything, a strange, guilty gratitude that they'd spent the war's end here, in Texas, safe and fed and treated with a dignity that Germany's government had not extended to its enemies. "We can go home," Anna said, but her voice carried no joy. "To what?" Greta asked. No one answered. One. Repatriation took months to organize. The logistics of moving millions of prisoners, refugees, and displaced persons across a war-shattered world were staggering. Camp Hearn began processing releases, but slowly, bureaucratically, with the grinding inefficiency of military administration. The women continued working at the ranch through May, June, July. Caldwell needed the help. His sons hadn't returned yet, might not return for months. And the work gave the prisoners structure while they waited. On Greta's last day, in August 1945, Jim and Mary Caldwell organized a small farewell. The core group, the ranchers, their wives, the guards who'd worked most closely with the women, gathered in the ranch yard for an informal meal. It was awkward, everyone trying to mark the moment without making it sentimental. These were not friends exactly. The circumstances precluded that. But they were something, people who'd shared labor and meals and small kindnesses across an artificial divide. Mary gave Greta the sun hat she'd worn all year. "Souvenir," she said simply. Jim shook her hand, his grip firm but brief. "You did good work. Should be proud of that." Frank Ochoa gave her a photograph. Greta on horseback, taken sometime in spring, her face turned toward the camera, almost smiling. She didn't remember the moment, but the evidence was there. "Remember Texas," he said. "I could never forget," she replied. Greta Hoffmann returned to Munich in September 1945. The city was rubble. Her family's apartment building was gone, replaced by a crater. Her mother was alive, barely, surviving in a displaced persons camp. Her father had died of pneumonia in March. She worked as a nurse in the occupation hospitals, treating Germans and Allied soldiers alike, using skills she'd maintained even in captivity. She married in 1948, a man who'd survived Stalingrad and came home broken but living. They had 2 children, a modest life rebuilt from ruins. She never spoke much about her time in Texas. It seemed too strange, too disconnected from the narrative of suffering that defined the German post-war experience. Who would believe that she'd learned to milk cows and ride horses while her country burned? That enemy ranchers had treated her with more dignity than her own government had shown its citizens? But she kept the sun hat and the photograph, and in her kitchen, decades later, a small wooden sign painted with words she'd learned in broken English during those early morning rides. "Home on the range." Her children asked what it meant. She told them it was complicated, that the war had been more complex than history books suggested, that people were capable of both cruelty and kindness, often simultaneously. She told them about a Texas morning, frost on the ground, breath visible in the air, standing in a corral while a weathered cowboy showed her how to approach a horse without fear. How he'd said, "They can smell fear, but they can also smell kindness. Give them kindness and they'll return it." It was, she said, the best lesson the war had taught her. Accidentally, improbably, in a place she'd never expected to find wisdom. The cows had been milked at dawn, the eggs had been collected. The work had continued even when the world was